consider it a very special honor today to have Jonathan Reckford as our guest on Conversing. Jonathan is the CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. He's a person who leads an organization that is a response really to a global crisis, which is housing. We're going to explore all of that through the lens of Habitat and what Jonathan sees. But let me just give you a little bit of a background. Habitat is an organization that's a Christian housing organization that has helped more than 46 million people construct, rehabilitate, or preserve their homes. Jonathan took the responsibilities as CEO in 2005, and at the time that he did that, in all 50 states and over 70 countries, Habitat has grown during the years of Jonathan's leadership from serving 125,000 individuals each year to now helping 7.1 million people last year build strength, stability, and self-reliance through shelter. Among all the great things that Habitat has done is that it is itself an exemplary organization. I just delight in using that language because while Jonathan is not a person who needs or is given to such necessary accolades, I think it's really important that we really understand that the significance of his leadership has been recognized as a top influencer in nonprofit leadership in the United States. One of the great recognitions that Habitat has received is that it's been acknowledged to be one of the very, very best places to work. And I'm just so glad to be able to bring all those combinations, the work that you do, the character that you bring to it, the faith and faithfulness that you bring to it, and the competence to do things well in an area of such extraordinary need. Jonathan has written a book that's entitled Our Better Angels, 7 Simple Virtues That Will Change Your Life and the World. Jonathan, welcome to Conversing.
Mark, thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
When we met a few years ago, I was so immediately struck by the combination of gifts and opportunities, educational places where you've done such exceptional work. You've spent a great deal of your corporate life serving in international companies and major corporations. And I want to explore this, then along the way, you would become also the executive pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church in Edina, Minnesota. And then out of that, you're recruited to be the CEO of Habitat. So I'd like to start first with just having you give us more background to tell us that narrative arc and how it happened, that both by the Spirit of God and by your own sense of call, that you would go through this corporate life and then land at Habitat.
Well, it's, I often say, I think God has a sense of humor because my career made no sense to me. But now, as I've often found, it's easier to see God's fingerprints in the rearview mirror sometimes than at the time. And I look back and all the different experiences have turned out to be so valuable in really preparing me for Habitat's work. And I'll try to do the short version. I grew up in a family, teacher's kid in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in a family that cared deeply about social justice. I had a formative character in my life was my mother's mother. My grandmother was an iconic fighter for civil and human rights. And at the age of 64, she ran for Congress. And Walter Cronkite called her the conscience of Congress. And every time I saw her growing up, she would quote Micah 6:8. This audience would know, "He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God." And then she would ask me what I was going to do to be useful. And that was her view of the good life. We're supposed to be useful. And it took me a long time to figure out what that would look like. And I studied political science, and my plan was to go to law school and go into politics to be like her. And I came to the shocking realization I had no interest in being a lawyer. I just thought that's what you did. And I had to come up with a plan B. With naivete and hubris, I talked my way into a job at Goldman Sachs in corporate finance with the argument I would learn finance faster than they could teach other people how to communicate. And then I suffered mightily for the hubris of that. And I learned, it was a great education. I learned a huge amount, and I learned I probably wasn't supposed to be an investment banker. And I was not leading the kind of life I had imagined. And I was working all the time. I was acting out. And I felt I really needed to go and regain perspective. And I was I'll talk about two inflection points, but the first big inflection point was I was fortunate enough to get a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, which Henry Luce's parents were missionaries in China. And still to this day, his foundation sends 15 young Americans under the age of 30 from all fields to work in Asia. And I had loved sports and been an athlete, and Seoul, Korea was going to host the Olympics. And so I was able to go over on an international financing deal from Goldman and set up a job doing marketing work for the Olympic Organizing Committee, which was just kind of a dream. And then it gets a little more surreal. They said, well, we see all this rowing in your background and we qualify because we're the host country and we just fired our rowing coach. Would you help coach our rowing team? And I said, no, I'm completely unqualified. You should hire a professional coach. And they said, no, we really like this idea. So I left Goldman and went to the U.S. Rowing Coaching College, and the U.S. coaches were not very scared of the Koreans and were very generous. But I ended up living in the training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes, and you couldn't have had in a pre-internet world a more complete removal from anything that was familiar. And one of my goals for that year was to really come to grips with my faith, and God put the right person in my life. I had run into really smart people who didn't seem to have the Spirit, and I'd run into people who have the Spirit, but I was smart enough to use apologetics to debate them, to avoid really dealing with my own issues. And of the 15 of us, there was one other person in Korea, a lifelong dear friend, and he had just finished his PhD in ethics and is now one of the world's experts in the ethics of genetic engineering. And he had both the deep intellect, but also an ordained American Baptist pastor, and had that Spirit-filled grace that I was missing in my life. And he gave me the amazing gift of all of his Monday nights for the rest of that year. And we did the whole New Testament and systematic theology. And it was really through that process. I certainly would have called myself a Christian, but it was in that process that I really owned my faith as an adult, and as best I could, turned into a follower of Christ. And that really changed everything. I ended up going, I'll speed up now, back to business school. Back then, only 2 business schools thought you needed professional managements of nonprofits. And at that point, I was interested in leading some sort of missional or nonprofit work. So went to Stanford. Now that's a mainstream view. We should have professional management of nonprofits.
Yes.
And then in business school, which I think is less true now, my thesis was there weren't a lot of career paths right into the nonprofit world. And so I said, I'll go learn in the private sector and gain skills that I can then port across. And that turned into a much more meandering process. But I ended up getting really interested in how you grow businesses. And my professional career began starting and growing businesses within big companies. So at Marriott and then Disney, and then helping Circuit City take CarMax public. And then actually running, this is my business credibility will die. I was president of a company called Musicland that was at that time, one of the largest retailers of music and movies. When people actually went to the store and bought music on plastic discs, which some of your listeners may not be able to understand. And then my volunteer work had been coaching pastors and helping churches grow. And because my other thesis was seminaries weren't doing a great job of equipping pastors for the complexity of actually managing. And that led, then Best Buy bought Musicland, and suddenly, having thought, it was at some point I would make the jump. Suddenly I had a chance to walk away after a year of helping the merger work. And I did what I tell people not to do. I left without knowing what I would do next. And that became the next big inflection point where, with my wife's blessing, I went on a short-term mission trip to India. And God just broke my heart around poverty issues. And we were serving in rural India with the Bungi, who among the Dalits in India are at the absolute bottom of the outcasts. And literally at that point in rural areas, only able to hand clean latrines or clean up dead animals, not allowed to live in community. And half the children were dying by their 13th birthday. And it just, all those sort of latent social justice issues came pouring back.
Right.
And I came back from that, not knowing what I would do, but from a heart perspective, thinking, okay, it's time. And this is a little embarrassing. Then I turned down 2 really good business jobs and almost got 2 nonprofit jobs. In both cases, got to the final pair. They hired somebody who'd already run a nonprofit, which made perfect sense. And then everything just stopped. All the doors closed. And it's a little embarrassing. I had my list of, okay, God, I'll do anything you want as long as it meets my, geographic, financial, ego gratification, family, and long list of criteria.
Right.
And, I think what I really heard first was, I care more about your character than your job. And second, so let's focus on that. And then it was just a time of being a stay-at-home dad, and it was hard on my ego, but really good for me to pull my identity away from my work. I was doing a ton of volunteer work, helping my local church, and then getting to coach every team and go on every field trip with the kids, which was lovely. And then, to my surprise, the church asked if I would come and help lead the church. Our church had exploded in size, and this would allow my dear friend to be the senior pastor, or he was the senior pastor, to be the spiritual leader of the church, but not be consumed in all the management pieces of what had become a large and complex church with a church within the church. And it was a little scary because everyone I trusted for career advice said, don't do this, which was daunting. But as my wife Ashley and I prayed about it, it seemed, as best we could tell, clear that that's, as I was supposed to go help. And I always loved that, Henry Blackaby quote, if you're not sure what to do, go where God is at work and join him there. And I felt, God was moving in this church and they were doing exciting things, and that I could make a contribution. And I think really the God thing, because I really believe, and I tell young people this, if I had said, okay, I'm going to go work in the church so my perfect job will show up 2 years later, it would never have worked. But as soon as I accepted the job, I got a call from one of the big international headhunting firms with a chance to run an internet retailer. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a great job. Deep pause. I'm going to go work for my local church. And I thought, okay, I have exited that world, and that's okay. And
Right.
And 2 years later, not looking, happily working at the church, which was a joyful time. And that same headhunter called back, Jonathan, do you know anybody who'd be interested in Habitat for Humanity? And if I could have named one job that met all my ridiculous list of criteria, and including being back in Georgia for my southern wife who had lived in Minnesota for 7 years at this point, it would have been Habitat. And I never thought they would pick me, but it was. I remember writing this long letter that night because, like so many people, I thought Jimmy Carter ran it. I didn't know why he was stepping down.
Exactly.
But saying, I don't know if I'm right for this, but I think this is the kind of thing God has been preparing me for all this time. And it was so interesting because that time of waiting and then the time of serving in the local church was the perfect complement, looking back to my corporate experience, to be ready for Habitat, which is somewhere between a Fortune 500 company and a denomination. It's an odd, odd hybrid. And so that was 2005. And up to then, I'd always felt like, I actually liked everything I'd done, but I always never felt like it was sort of the final destination. And when I got to Habitat, as you could tell, I could never keep a job. So this is record territory, but it is, there really hasn't been anything else I'd rather do since I got here. And that's a great gift.
It's a really great gift. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's a rich and full of surprise kind of story. So I love that. And I love the fact that it's not linear, only for the fact that it, I think, speaks both of your temperament and your capacity to be able to be flexible, but also to be trying to grow in your capacity to be responsive to the leadership of the Spirit that moves in different and often unexpected ways. So that's really a wonderful story. Now you've been there 18 years, and I think about the significance of the last, let's just call it 20 years. And I would say in the United States and in many other places too, issues of housing have become such primary issues. I would say it's been in the last 20 years, especially in the United States, that homelessness and in any case, struggles over housing, habitats themselves are just a daily crisis for really millions of people, and that this sector that Habitat responds to is just exactly in that zone. So before we get into the details about that I want to have you help us unpack, let's start with just the name Habitat itself. I mean, I've always I've always loved that it's called Habitat, and I have my own reasons why I love that word. But I'm just curious, as to say housing and habitat aren't the same thing, and habitat, as I know is a much richer word than simply housing. So, talk to us about habitat, housing, what those words mean, and why habitat.
I think the very quick origin story is really an extraordinary and wonderful story. So it starts with a really a prophetic pastor who was ahead of his time, and a man named Clarence Jordan, an unknown hero, I think, in the church and in our country, who started an interracial farm in southwest Georgia in 1942. And you can imagine how popular an interracial farm in southwest Georgia in 1942 was. And he called it a demonstration plot for the kingdom of God. And he had a degree in agriculture and a degree in Greek. And he wrote his own version of the gospel of the New Testament in Southern vernacular called the Cotton Patch Gospel. And it's a treasure.
I love that.
It is. And he and the farm always struggled, bombed, boycotted, harassed, and never did very well. But he had a significant influence on a whole generation of pastors. He was believed in nonviolent social protest and lived it in an extraordinary way. And in the 60s, he gathered a group of people together to pray about what might be next, because the farm was really struggling. And out of this week of prayer, he wrote the most extraordinary letter that I think, again, was way ahead of its time. And the whole letter is fantastic. But he came up in it with this idea of a fund for humanity. And it wasn't just housing, but housing was going to be the first area they tested. And the idea was, there was a beautiful quote. He said, "What the poor need is not charity, but capital. Not caseworkers, but co-workers. And what the rich need is a wise, honorable, and just way of divesting themselves of their overabundance." And I think there's so much in that. And then the idea of the fund for humanity was they would come alongside sharecropping farmers living in these terrible shacks, and they would build a very simple home. They could build a little house for $6,000. I wish that were still true. And they would give them a 20-year no-interest loan, and they would then pay back the loan, and in the spirit of Christian community, keep making payments so that the fund would be sustainable. And they called that the Fund for Humanity. And a social entrepreneur, before we used that term, had come to the farm to repair his marriage, and Millard Fuller. And he took this idea and went as a missionary with Disciples of Christ. After they built some homes right on the farm in Georgia, he went to Zaire, now Congo, and did this for 3 years in 73. And then in 1976, the Fund for Humanity became Habitat for Humanity, and that was the official beginning. And to your point, what I love about Habitat is it's bigger than just a physical structure. When we think about home versus a house, there's a lot more to it in terms of how it fits into the community, what that means for all the psychological and security and all the things that come with having a home from which to be launched. And it is, and to grow into all that God intends, as we would say. So it's been quite extraordinary. And Millard was sort of this extraordinarily charismatic guy. And if you sat with him on a plane, you would start Habitat wherever you lived. And so it grew very much as a grassroots movement more than an organization. And then living into the complexity of how do you keep the movement, but also make things work better as an organization. And that's what we have been trying to continue to live into.
Right. Well, I do think that story expresses obviously what I was feeling after, which is this amazing sense of the holism of what I think Habitat intends to be very attentive to and engaged with, so that the holism of people's lives, the structures, the realities of the layers of challenges that exist beyond simply the fact of a building or a structure, as you say. So talk to us about, kind of give us first some big demographic pictures. Let's focus for the moment on Habitat for Humanity inside the United States. How would you depict and describe at a high level the housing crisis of America?
So, as you said earlier, the heartbreaking news is it's never been worse in sort of modern times in the U.S. in terms of the ability for the median income family to be able to rent or purchase the median cost home. That gap has exploded. And I think there are a number of factors. Sort of quick assessment is, if you looked, the market got overheated, and most people remember in 2008 we had this huge housing crash that impacted the whole global economy. And there were a lot of mistakes made, and some wrong lessons that were learned from that. But one of the things because of that is all the small home builders went out of business largely. And then banks tightened up their lending dramatically. So what happened as a result is we underbuilt as a country for the next decade by hundreds of thousands of units a year. So we created over time then a supply problem. And depending on whose estimates, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, the realtors, the ranges from about 3.5 million to 6.5 million units short of housing. And it's dramatically short at the affordable or sort of entry level end of that housing. And so when you have a shortage of housing, you get, prices get bid up. And then you had zero interest rates in the US for an extended period of time and negative interest rates in Europe. And you had Chinese and other wealthy people trying to put their money somewhere. So money poured into real estate in a way that disproportionately pushed up prices of real estate relative to incomes. There ought to be a historically relationship between the incomes and rents or mortgages. And then COVID exacerbated that because suddenly everybody wanted more real estate. So demand spiked during COVID. Supply chain got disrupted. So actually the ability to create housing went in the wrong direction. And that flood of federal stimulus funding poured in, and the private market started buying up all the entry-level housing in many markets. You put all those forces together, and California, always incredibly difficult. New York City, Hawaii, always incredibly difficult. But suddenly, Atlanta, Georgia, prices are up 60%. Florida prices are up double in some markets in just a few years. I was just in South Carolina, prices up 60%. Nashville, Dallas, the places where historically we could build lots of low-cost housing quite quickly and inexpensively. The math moved, and incomes have gone up, but not nearly as much as. So suddenly now you've got, even before COVID, 1 in 4 families in the United States was cost burden, paying too much of their income on housing. And now that has gotten far worse. And, we would never say housing is the only need. But I think for most people who don't think about the importance of housing, they've always had good housing. And I think we tend to take it for granted. And in many ways, what I would say is housing is a prerequisite for so many other things, that if you have safe, stable housing, you stay healthier, you do better in school, you've got a sort of psychological safety, all of which lead to an upward path. And if you pull housing out, many of those other outcomes don't come together. And if you're paying 50% of your income on your rent or mortgage, then you're making heartbreaking choices about what you can't then do for your family in terms of health and education and food security and other needs. And so I would say, and now we've had a crisis for a long time. What happened, I think, in the last few years as it's gotten so extreme is that now middle-class families' children suddenly can't afford housing. So now the invisible crisis has become a visible crisis. And if, the only thing I'd say is if we can bring good out of bad, every mayor, governor, national leader I've talked to, now housing is right up at the top of their agenda. And that's good news. But unfortunately, we are so far behind that it's going to take it's going to be challenging and very expensive to fix at this point because costs are up so high.
Right. Well, what strikes me about your wonderful summary is that it demonstrates how multi-layered and complex the problem is, and how many different angles of influence got us into this situation, and therefore how difficult, and as you well point out, of course, how expensive it is to then get yourself out. So when the average person, let's say you're driving along in the streets of Oakland, where we are now living, and you still, of course, see encampments, and people can blithely drive by and say, they just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps or get their life in order or simply give up this or that bad habit. It's just a failure to really understand what has actually brought about the circumstances and how Herculean it is, especially if you're caught in circumstances like that, to even imagine finding a safe, clean place, just simply to begin, as you say, life in a house, in a structure, in a protected, sheltered context. And then how you overcome all these other manifold layers that you've just described. It's a staggering problem. And it's now, I think, a chronic problem. Is that inappropriate to call it a chronic problem now that we're facing?
No, I think it's real. And, if you think about, there were plenty of problems in the 1950s, but I think about, the in a way, what is now a Habitat house, 1,100 square feet, 3 bedroom, very simple house, was a normal family house. So one is our sort of expectations of home, went up, the average square foot per person, all those things. But if you think about that, in general, a one income family could afford a home like that.
Right. Right.
And now, it takes two incomes and maybe family support to be able to save a down payment, and home ownership is really moving out. A not funny anecdote, but I was with the mayor of a very lovely resort area where we were raising money last week. And suddenly it was personal for him because his son couldn't afford housing and moved back in with him.
Right.
So suddenly, oh, we've got a housing problem. Well, the reality is that, there was already a huge housing problem, and it ties to traffic, it ties to the environment, it ties to so many things. Because if you think about California, where, people are, I always would interview my Lyft or Uber driver, and so often they've got a full-time, decent paying job, and they're driving hour and a half or 2 hours because you're driving to where you can get. But that's horrible for their family. That's terrible for the environment. It's terrible for their quality of life. And so the ideal from a community perspective is mixed income, mixed use, which is how cities were historically designed. And it's been really a more modern phenomenon that we've created this enormous economic segregation. And I would argue with all our needed conversations about race and about difference, in some ways, the most insidious divide in our society is economic, that we've become an economically segregated society. And I think that has enormous negative long-term effects. And that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. Enormous negative effects. I'm Mark Labberton. You're listening to Conversing. So let's now have you do the same sort of sketch of the international housing crisis. That obviously is infinitely bigger than just the United States and is highly varied across the world. But you have a glimpse of that, and Habitat is heavily engaged internationally. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I would say it's in some ways sort of a global north, global south. So if you took South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, it looks a lot like the U.S. There's an affordability crisis because we're not building enough housing. Global South is a little bit different. You've got a huge qualitative challenge. In some places like Latin America, there's enough housing, but the quality is so substandard in terms of what we would see as safe, decent, and affordable. And then you've got a couple of mega trends. So you've got rapid urbanization that has been happening for a long time, which is probably the largest mega trend. So cities that were built for 1 million people have 5 million people. A city that was built for 3 million people has 15 million people. So the infrastructure and planning did not keep up. And then we've got 1 billion people living in informal settlements. And that's become a big issue for our advocacy work, is how do we help people living informally to become formalized. So in many cases, what COVID did there was dropped incomes. So you did have supply chain, you did have inflation, but the biggest problem is people have such low incomes that you still have a giant affordability crisis that has gotten worse in many ways. So it's I think what we didn't have in much of the global north was economies, partly because we had, especially in the U.S., the ability to put out an ocean of federal spending to kind of prop up the economy. And many countries in the global south could not do that. And therefore, their indebtedness as a country skyrocketed, and we've seen poverty increase. A lot of families, one of the great success stories in a way of the last 25 years was moving, a massive number of people, 1 billion people in China out of abject poverty into, certainly not wealth, but into the lower middle class. And we saw, sadly, hundreds of millions of people be pulled back into poverty with the pandemic, and which is heartbreaking. So the challenge is a little different. The other mega trend is climate change. And then you throw the war on top of that, and we're seeing the largest migration since World War II, and in terms of global movement. But of course, that creates a housing challenge because people are being forced out of where they live they're going to new places, and largely there's not enough housing where they go. And so, again, exacerbating the size of the challenge. Maybe I can take a second. Everybody kind of knows habitat, but most people actually, I always laugh, the two things people know best about habitat aren't actually true. So the first one is everyone thinks President Carter started and runs habitat. That is actually not true, though he put it on the map, and that's another story. The second is people think we give away houses. And I think what has been central to what has made habitat so powerful is that sense of partnership all the way back to the very beginning, where we work with families that banks won't lend to, and instead of a cash down payment, which is almost impossible for a subsistence income family, they put in what we call sweat equity, literally putting hundreds of hours in of helping build their home and their neighbors' homes. And then they have to take classes in home maintenance and financial management, and then demonstrate clean credit and the ability to pay back an affordable mortgage that's pegged to their income. And as a result of that, we've had extraordinarily high success rate for families who are technically subprime borrowers. But that sense of partnership and community has meant that these families have been extraordinarily successful. And what we've seen over time is not that everybody should be a homeowner, but especially for low-income and low-income minority families, owning a home has been the best way to create a financial asset over time. And when you look at the wealth disparity, most of it is explained by whether or not people own houses. And so it's, a house should not be a financial investment. It should be a safe place to live. But it turns out to be a long-term savings that creates an intergenerational asset that has been so powerful for so many families. So that was the beginning. I would say the big shift that led to the next level of growth for us was recognizing that we could never build enough houses to solve poverty housing. And so we were growing really fast, but we projected out, and it's like, if we kept compounding our growth rate, how long would it take for us to achieve our vision of everyone having decent housing? And I think the answer back then was 1,032 years, which felt unacceptably slow.
Probably longer than the time that you'll be serving as CEO. Yes.
Exactly.
Right. Got it.
So we changed our framing question from how many houses can we build, which was a good question, to what would it take to meaningfully reduce the housing deficit in all the places we serve, which is a much more scary question, but forces you into systems change and really looking at the whole ecosystem and figuring out how you can change the enabling environment, how you can get the market to work better for low-income families, how we can reduce barriers that would allow families to improve their own housing. And so that led us into becoming a global leader in housing microfinance and creating a new industry, essentially, to get microfinance banks to start doing home lending. We started a shelter venture lab to work with private sector actors coming up with better building materials for the poor. We've done some innovative ways to help train people. And then our big advocacy was around property rights. So in so many places, women and marginalized groups don't have the right to own property, even if they've lived there for generations. And if you don't have the right to stay, it doesn't make sense to invest. You can't borrow against it. It's a whole series of challenges come. So in a way, we're trying to make that whole housing value chain work better. And I'll just give you a glimpse. I was in Kenya last month, and it was such a fascinating day that sort of showed some of the breadth of habitat. In the morning, we met with the Southern Africa Health Research Center, CDC supported, is the leading health research center for Southern Africa. And we're doing a partnership with them to study how small interventions in housing can reduce malaria. And the results are really promising. And relatively small interventions around screening and around how the house is designed have shown 80 to 90% reductions in malaria. So really significant health change.
Incredible.
And then I went to visit a micro manufacturer that through our shelter tech, African Shelter Tech, won an award, and we then invested with them. And then we're using local habitats to actually prove out their model. And they've come up with a more eco-friendly, called a twist block. But if you think about it, sort of almost like giant Legos, a new way of design that doesn't need mortar, can be built very effectively, and is a more climate-friendly vehicle. And we were learning how those homes were working. And then we went to a community where Habitat had, we don't view you're properly housed unless you've got water and sanitation. And with the drought in especially Western Kenya, we had dug for a series of communities a new borehole well that was then in a whole piping system to get water to about 10 villages. And the water had come in at twice the volume and less salinity. And there was a sense of just new life to see water, emerge. And for us, you'd say that's not housing, but you can't really be housed if you don't have water. And it's then we went and dedicated 13 homes for extremely vulnerable families that were very traditional habitat, and moving, a family was moving from a 6x8 tin shack that no one should live in into a very simple but safe, secure house, a door they could lock with water and sanitation. And it won't solve all their problems, but it gives them a starting place, at least, that gives them a chance. And so I share that just to that we've gotten much more complicated, but in some ways I think we're having a much deeper level of impact, and I'm excited about that.
And that kind of multidisciplinary integration across so many different dimensions, which again is part of the holistic vision that we were referring to earlier. I just think that must have been one of your very best days as CEO, in the sense of just a condensation of so many different dimensions.
Well, I loved it because I'm not wired. COVID was awful for the world, and selfishly, doing life by video is it's wonderful that we have the technology. It's wonderful we can connect the world, but it doesn't replace face to face and actually being in communities and being with people. And that's where you learn so much of what's really going on when you're out in the community.
Yeah, yeah. If in many ways you're already answering this question by what you've just shared, but because you do have this unique perch in seeing the global housing crisis in the way that you've just demonstrated, if you were, king of the world, and you could pull three most important strings to try to change things in the positive direction, what would they be? I mean, some of them are built into the things that you've already said, but just give us your sense of where the most important levers are.
So the first thing I would say is it has to be a multi-sector approach, and each sector plays a really critical role. Public sector really sets the enabling environment. They control land use and very often financing or other needed subsidy. The private sector is the best at building at scale, and we need the private capital to build. We have such a supply gap. We need a huge effort from the private sector. But civil society plays an important role as well, the social sector. And often we hear about public-private partnerships, but we've often seen really bad outcomes if you have a public-private partnership without the voice of the communities. And I think that's where civil society can shine. And so the best, we would call it a 4P, public-private people partnerships, to actually create a sustainable design. So that's the first thing. I think the second I already mentioned, which is mixed income, mixed use, helping people to live close to where that they work. And also the data is overwhelming that children from low-income families who grow up in mixed-income neighborhoods still have the American dream. They have quite reasonable social mobility, but children growing up in concentrated poverty have virtually no social mobility, and the data is overwhelming. So I think that's the second. The third is probably that everybody's going to have to be a little unhappy. The not in my backyard turns out to be the one area of bipartisan agreement in our country. And so, we have to build more. Now, we should have more density close to transit. It doesn't mean everywhere needs more, but we need a lot more supply. So for the business side and conservatives, we need to make it easier and faster to build. And California is a shining example of making it slow and difficult to build. That drives a huge increased cost. But on the flip side, we've got to be friendlier and build in the right places and build a lot more. I used to call it carrot and stick for the developer. Something like inclusionary zoning, I think is a very good thing. But if you just put in inclusionary zoning, which is a stick, but no carrot, we end up with a token number of affordable units, but not nearly enough volume. And so a friend of mine just said, which I love, what we really need is a cake and a 2x4, which I thought was a little more evocative. But it can't just be 2x4, but we need a little incentive, and then we need some cake to make the math work, because ultimately it's kind of a math problem. If you're a good-hearted developer, which we certainly are, we actually cannot build something, at a price that a family without some subsidy can actually afford to rent or purchase, and nor can a private sector developer. So we've got to find ways. The last is design, which is the cities and don't have to build the housing, but they've got a plan for the housing. So if you're a growing city, you've got to allocate ahead of time the infrastructure. And if you allocate the infrastructure and just hold land for housing, the market will then build the housing. But if you don't, you end up with informal settlements and slums and uncontrolled growth. And so there's some really cool examples of that. I was building in an informal settlement in Colombia outside Bogota. And there, the families had lived there since they'd escaped rural areas during the narco wars, 30 years at this point, but they didn't have legal right to stay. So the first step was moving from 64 steps to get right to stay to 16 steps, and then helping those families actually get title. Once they had title, you started seeing houses being sold. You saw commercial buildings popping up. You saw value. The next thing, which was brilliant, is they put in cable cars and bus rapid transit. So instead of 3 hours into downtown Bogota, it was going to be 30 minutes. That opened up a whole economic opportunity. But it took a systemic look at what it would take. The government did not have to actually do the housing upgrading. And Habitat and other actors could come in and work with the families and make loans. But now the family could borrow because they saw the opportunity and knew that they could get the benefit of that increased investment in making their home safer, healthier, or better. And so lots of different ways. But I think those would be at a principal level, that's where I would start.
Yes, it's a terrific answer. If you take that answer and you had the capacity to apply it and work it out, are we talking a quarter century, a half century?
The bad news, I think, is that we will never fully solve it, though I believe, God can do anything. And so yes. I don't want to rule out miracles, but the size of the need is so massive. But I think a couple things, one more principle that would help is thinking about budgeting differently. So for instance, I was in New Zealand and the health minister on a panel we were on together said that the most effective health intervention the country could make would be winterizing homes for elderly in New Zealand, because the country would save so much spending on tuberculosis and pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses. But our budgets don't often work that way. So thinking more holistically about interventions and then capturing the savings, if we or similarly, if we build mixed income, mixed use, you actually don't have to spend as much on new roads because people actually can get to work. So I think we can be more creative, and I think it's going to take every kind of solution to get there. I gave an example of of what can happen if get creative about finding. One piece would be preserving housing, and we have a lot of houses in historically underserved and distressed areas that are not expensive, but they're very low quality. And the math problem is it will take more to bring them up to proper code than they will appraise for after you make that investment. So our top advocacy priority in the U.S. context is something called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which would be a tax credit that would help cover the gap between that appraisal value and what it costs to fix the house if you then sell it to an income qualified buyer. So this could potentially quickly preserve and upgrade hundreds of thousands of units and get them back on the market far faster than we could build all those units. And many of them are in good locations, but in neighborhoods that have been underserved. And I think one of our social problems with gentrification is it's understandable to fight changes to your neighborhood if you're going to be displaced and can't go anywhere. If we actually had, pathways, some gentrification is really good. You want grocery stores, you want jobs, you want,
right.
Amenities in your community, but you don't want to be displaced. And that's
right.
where we've got to get creative. An example in Charlottesville, Virginia, super expensive area now. Somebody was going to buy a trailer park, but they were going to evict everybody and put in high-end housing. Habitat came in with a coalition, and it purchased the trailer park and reorganized it, but did it with no displacement. So they built a little mixed income area, high-end home ownership and rental. And so everybody could stay, but they got a lot more units onto the project. And I think we need more of that kind of creativity.
Right, absolutely. It's impossible to talk about Habitat for very long before, as you referred to, Jimmy Carter's name came up. And because he's recently entered hospice and his days with us are closing, I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit about his role in Habitat and just your own relationship with him over the years of leading Habitat.
Well, it's very sad for me because he's a hero to me. One of the great privileges of my life is for the last 17 years I've spent a week every year somewhere in the world building alongside him, and it's extraordinary. And what I often say is, when you think about integrity as wholeness, that you're the same person in all circumstances. I've been with President Carter with some of the most powerful people in the world and the least powerful people in the world, and he's always the same. And he's had an amazing life, and this is where faith matters. His faith is strong, and I remember I've been sharing this in the media, but I remember probably 6-7 years ago he was diagnosed with cancer, and his press conference was remarkable because he said, "Look, my faith is strong. I don't especially want to die now, but I'm okay. I know where I'm going. I'm fine with that." And then miraculously, he beats cancer. And you fast forward, one of my more stressful mornings, but we were building in Canada 150 homes for the 150th anniversary of Canada, and President Carter gets overheated and gets a little woozy, just bent down and picked something up, and out of abundance of caution, the Secret Service whisks him off, and he calls me from the car quite grumpily and says, "I'm fine," I said, "Okay, what do you want me to tell?" Because unfortunately the press conference was lined up and all the cameras had captured this moment. And he said, "Tell him I'm fine and get back to work." And I think if I combine those two, and then he came back the next day and built again. So we got two giant waves of publicity, but it is, I think his message to all of us is, I'm fine. Spiritually, he is secure in where he's going, and the rest of us should get back to work. And in a way, the best way to honor his extraordinary legacy of faith and service is to go out and serve. And he's often said, though he's done so many good things, that Habitat for Humanity was the best way he knew to put his Christian faith into action in a tangible way. And that feeling out on the build site where all those differences melt away, and everybody has something to give and everyone has something to gain when we work together, and that is what kept him coming back. He got involved. Most people think he started Habitat. He got involved. He actually got involved, as he would say, when he was involuntarily retired from the White House in 1980. He came back to Plains, Americus, where Habitat had started. That farm, Koinonia Farm, was about 5 miles from Plains, and so he started going to church with Habitat people who came to his church, and he kept hearing more about it. And then in 1984 was the pivotal moment. He was up in New York for a conference with the UN, and he went running, as he often did, and he ran by a Habitat build site where some young people were struggling to rehab a tenement building, and he made the offhand comment, we should come help these young people. And the founder of Habitat heard that, the press heard that, and a number of months later, a busload of folks with the Carters came up from Plains, Georgia, and they slept in a church basement and helped work for a week rehabbing this tenement building. And no one had ever seen a former president of the United States behave this way.
Right.
And and then they came back the next year to finish the building, and that became the annual Carter Project. And all over the world, I think his involvement brought out volunteers, brought out donors, inspired people to get involved in the mission. And so what I would say is he put Habitat on the map, and it really never could have become what it has become without that engagement. And it is, it's a piece of his much bigger legacy, but certainly he's had a huge impact on so many of us.
Absolutely. It's an enormously important story. Jonathan, as we come to the close of our conversation, I just wonder, can you look back on these 17, 18 years that you've been in this role and tell us how you have been changed by this work and its many intersections?
I think it's funny is I realized I actually liked changing jobs, because when I changed jobs, I learned more, and it would create new challenges. And I found actually I liked that. What's happened, Habitat is so infinitely complex that I've never gotten bored, and it keeps changing. So, I've learned so much, I think, about being more a truly global citizen. For someone who grew up in the United States, I think it has challenged and deepened my faith. I think the saddest part is I've seen just, heartbreaking, examples around the world of both natural and man-made disasters and the devastating cost of those. And I think that's some of the least fun. But then you get to see that if we can organize and pull people together, you can bring good out of those crises and help people rebuild, which I have loved. I think it has. A wise person said long ago, there are problems you solve and tensions you manage. And in a world that is increasingly kind of polarized and black and white, I just see the world in so many shades of gray. And I think getting more and more comfortable living in the tensions and the tensions of financial security versus faith, that faith versus foolishness for the organization. I think the tension of being Christ-centered and radically inclusive, which are both tent poles of our work, but I think there's some in society who would say you can only pick one. And for me, I think the framing is so important because I increasingly and passionately believe we're inclusive because of our faith, not instead of our faith. And in fact, the danger is if you accept that framing, I think we see faith get squeezed out very quickly. So that one has been important. The tension in a way between the global north and south, we have this sort of unique, massive footprint with 1,100 local affiliates in the United States, and then the desperate need in the rest of the world. But I hope I've grown as a leader. I think it's been a humbling role in many ways. I think my role has evolved and changed over time. And I think so more and more I'm spending time really as an advocate for housing and trying to drive policy and drive funding streams and spending a little less time in daily management, which I think probably makes sense, and hopefully building the team and organization to be sustainable. But it has been an incredibly wonderful adventure and never boring. I think the other tension that I just have to acknowledge is, there is a tension between taking care of my family and work, and I probably traveled more miles than would be ideal for my family, and I have mixed feelings about that. I love being in the communities, but I don't like being on all the airplanes and being away from home as much as I have over the years. So it's as I often say, God never said it would be easy, just that it would be good. I've not found really anything easy about affordable housing. But in our good moments, you get to see, real incarnation and real transformation. And in some ways, I think in our increasingly unchurched world, the being the hands and feet of Christ in a tangible way and just loving people is the starting point to so many good things, versus some of the thing I most worry about is this sort of politicization of having politics drive faith rather than our faith inform our politics. And in the same way, even though it's not our prime mission, which is housing, one of the things that I really lean into, and we're doing in a very formal way, is using service for bridge building very intentionally across faith and across race and across other kinds of difference. Because, one of the ahas to me as a volunteer before I was an employee of Habitat, we used to think really of volunteers as a construction strategy. And I think one of the big mental model shifts was thinking about volunteers as a social change strategy. It's not the most efficient way to build houses, but it's an incredibly powerful way to build community.
Right. Jonathan, I know that our time is at an end, and I just want first to express personal gratitude for your leadership and for the way that you personally embody the values of Habitat, but both as an embodiment of the gospel itself. So thank you so much for that, and the competencies and capacities that you've led and the extraordinary growth. I do also want to say, on behalf of all who are listening, that we are all cheerleaders of Habitat, and many, 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 I'm sure, of our listeners have been involved in one way or another in Habitat builds. And it's one of the points of light that I look to around the world or an organization that converges around a clarity of faith that manifests itself in the world in tangible and transformational ways for the reasons and in the patterns that you've described. And there aren't lots of places that feel as though they bring a holistic vision in a genuinely enacted way and in a way that is deeply integrative of many, many values and tangible responses to real crises. So I just know that there's people all around the world whose lives have been changed because of Habitat, and many people who have been changed by Habitat who have never been the recipients or participants necessarily in a build, but who just feel the radiant goodness of what Habitat is up to. So I just want to say thank you for you and for Habitat and for this conversation. Thank you so much for making time.
Well, it's a pleasure, Mark. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for your leadership. It is it's a complicated time to lead anything, I think, in these past few years, and it's one of the toughest times, I think, for leaders of all stripes and organizations. But it has been a great privilege, and I feel incredibly grateful to get to be a part of it. And it's great to be with you today.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to Conversing on your favorite podcast app to listen to new episodes as they are released. And please, leave a review. Conversing is produced by Peter Laberton and distributed by Fuller Studio.